So we did the croissants last weekend, and we're having a bit of a trouble getting the sizes down, the size of the actual video to a manageable size to be able to upload. So stay tuned. We might just go from episode 1 to episode 4. Today, we're going to go ahead and make these lovely frosted cinnamon rolls with sticky syrup out of the Cuisine at Home cast iron cooking. And I'm going to make these lovely, lovely cinnamon rolls in my cast iron skillet. Now, I know it might be a little strange to make cinnamon rolls on a cast iron skillet, but you know, to be honest, I do a lot of things on my cast iron skillet, and it is kind of an all-in-one pan kind of deal. And there aren't a lot of, it's very simple ingredients. You basically got cinnamon and salt and brown sugar and butter, and you know, of course, we're going to make up the dough, which it's a yeast dough. But I thought today you might want to be interested in knowing that I was actually wearing a Billy Idol shirt today. And it did remind me of a funny story about meeting Billy Idol only before a concert instead of after. We were with our good friends Carol and Al, and we were in line to see Billy Idol. And I believe it was probably his handler. I'm not really sure who it is that would come out and, you know, whoever their pre-person is. I mean, they've all got handlers, right? Or people who manage things at different sites. And he kind of stood in front of the long line of people that were waiting to talk to Billy for, like, you know, a hot second. And he said, "I'm just telling you now that if there's any kissing, licking, or groping, we're going to shut this line down." And I was shocked, A, that this would be something we'd have to be admonished about, and B, obviously I was presuming it had happened at some other meet and greet in order for us to get the admonition. So it was interesting, and I was worried because I sort of scanned the people ahead of me and behind me, more the people ahead of me, because they would be the ones, if they were doing any of those three things, would shut the line down. And I honestly didn't know if we were going to be shut down or not. I didn't know. And it was possible. I just was surprised, let's say, that we had to be told not to do any of those three things. I would have never even thought about it. But I guess if you're Billy Idol, perhaps that brings out those three things in people. But luckily, none of those three things happened, at least in the beginning of the line, as to the point that we were at in line. And so we were able to meet him and had a lovely conversation, and there was none of the naughty business happening. So that was just an interesting thing, and I thought, it's kind of a gloomy day today, but we're going to make these comforting cinnamon rolls, and so maybe it's a little time for Billy Idol. Well, let's go ahead and get started on these frosted cinnamon rolls with sticky syrup. The first thing we're going to do is, it's actually going to be our cast iron skillet. It's kind of a one-stop shop as far as a pan for the cinnamon rolls. So what we're going to do is go ahead and melt 4 tablespoons of unsalted butter, along with 1/4 cup packed light brown sugar. Again, this all goes in our skillet. So 1/4 cup of the brown sugar, right in the pan. And then we're going to go ahead and also put in 1/4 cup of light corn syrup. The corn syrup is part of what creates our sticky syrup underneath the cinnamon rolls. And we'll see that as we go along, how that's going to work out. We'll basically be putting, once we melt this down on the stove, we're going to be putting our cinnamon rolls right on the sticky syrup. This will actually go on the stove, and we'll melt this down until the butter melts and the sugar dissolves. But we're going to actually hold off on doing that until we're closer to actually putting the dough on top of it, or the cinnamon rolls. I find that sometimes, even though sequentially in the recipe it comes first, you basically melt the butter, dissolve the sugars, and set it aside. But sometimes it sets aside too long from when you actually do this part of it and put the rolls on top. So we're going to go ahead and have this ready, set this aside, and then further on in the recipe, we'll see how this works. The next thing I'm going to do is actually get the filling ready, so we're ready to go. This calls for a 1/2 cup packed light brown sugar and 1 tablespoon of ground cinnamon. So we're going to go ahead and put actually our ground cinnamon into just a little bowl here. Again, using our great multi-spoons that we have and our measuring spoons. And then we're going to go ahead and add 1/2 cup of the light brown sugar. And then we're just going to give that a little whisk. And this, when it creates the filling, will be just a nice, we'll pat this in the dough and roll it over. The cinnamon rolls at the end of the day, it'll be sort of rolled into a log, and we'll cut those and put those on top of the syrup stuff that I just mentioned. But right now, we're just sort of preparing things in advance. So this is the filling that will go into the dough once we get that assembled and rolled out. We're going to go ahead and get the dough ready, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about the canisters I use for my flour and sugar. Now, these are not my grandmother's, but she had ones exactly like this when I was growing up. And so when I saw them at, I don't know if it was a flea market or maybe it was an auction house, I don't remember where anymore. I just know that when I bake and use these or see them on my shelf, it puts me right back in those great memories that I told you about having with my grandmother and baking with her after school. And it just brings me right back, and yet still propels me into the future. So I always feel like she's with me and my mother's with me when I get my canisters out to bake. It's always a great time whenever I get my canisters out. So that's kind of a fun, just a quick, I just think about that so often, how much I like my canisters. So for this, for our dough that we're going to make, we have our dough whisk, our pastry whisk that we're going to be using again. So that'll come in handy. We're going to have 2 3/4 of all-purpose flour. So 2 3/4 all-purpose flour. So going back a little bit to the night of the Billy Idol concert, I like story, I like memory, I like finding out why people do what they do, what propels them, what motivates them, how did they get to the point of time in their life. And on that night, this particular tour was just an acoustic set with his guitarist, Steve Stevens, who's been with him for a very long time. And it was just Billy and Steve Stevens singing their songs, telling their stories, telling the stories behind the songs. But one of the stories that Billy Idol talked about toward the end was his reconciliation, basically, with his father when his father was dying. His father had cancer, and he was able to sort of reconcile with his dad. I think. So now I'm going to put in 3 tablespoons of granulated sugar into my dough mix that we're going to whisk around. And one of the stories he told toward the end of the night was one of the reconciliation moments that he had with his dad. And I don't know if he was in hospice care or just at home in his own bedroom, but they were able to have that father and son talk that you hope for, or even between any parent or any loved one that you have at the end of life, that you hope you're able to have. And it's, I hear you. I know who you are. I see you. I'm so proud of you. And they were able to have that moment together before his father passed away. And I just think how grateful they both were to be able to have that moment to recognize each other and say, and for a father to say to his son, I'm proud of you, I see you, and for the son to say, yeah, I'm proud of you too. So that was a great story that he told. It made it very human, and it was a kind of a night for storytelling. And I think being able to do that just very acoustically and not have a big band allowed for that space and that time for that to happen. The only drawback I would say to that is I have found that people are they talk a lot at concerts. I don't know if you've found this to be true too, but I've been finding this a lot more lately, where there's so much talking at concerts. Sometimes it's hard to hear if the artist or whoever's talking. And I'm not really sure why that has come to pass. I've noticed it a lot more in the last few years. I don't understand why you would pay for a concert to go to a concert and then talk the whole time. And maybe just everybody didn't groove on the storytelling. You know, that's entirely possible. That's something that I really like, but that doesn't mean everybody else does. I just know that for me, that really made me think about Billy Idol in a whole new way, that everybody, whatever their persona is, still is a child of someone's and still wants that moment of reconciliation and transformation with a parent or a loved one. It doesn't matter. You just want that opportunity to have that conversation before the loved one passes on. So that was a great story. I loved that story, to be honest. It was something obviously that has stuck with me the whole evening. That's the thing that really stuck with me, besides the, you know, the incredulity that I had of the what we were told in the beginning before we saw him. So that aside, it was a great, I really, you know, it's not like I was a super fan ahead of time. I just appreciated him sharing this really heartfelt, honest story. So it made it for a great night of sort of storytelling, besides all the stories of how some of his songs came into being. So that was a lot of fun too. I've now just put 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder into my dough mix. Okay. The last thing I'm going to add is 3/4 salt. And they do call for table salt in here, and I go ahead and just add my kosher salt. I have made these before, and it doesn't seem to be a problem. So I'm gonna go ahead and do 3/4 teaspoon. And you know, with my lovely all-purpose multi-function spoon set, measuring spoon set, I actually have a 3/4 teaspoon, which I love because that means I don't have to do 3/4 teaspoons. Yes, I know. It seems so simple, but I tell you what, I love that. It makes things much simpler and eliminates some of the error. I don't know about you, but sometimes you can be distracted when you're measuring things out. Someone can ask you a question or come into the room, and it can be a time of distraction. So there we go. For the dough, we have the 2 3/4 cups all-purpose flour, 3 tablespoons granulated sugar, 1 tablespoon of yeast, 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, and 3/4 teaspoon of table salt. I've whisked that around with my dough whisk, and now I'm going to add 2 more ingredients to this that I'm going to add to this and make the yeast active. In this particular case, I'm not adding water. I'm adding 1 cup of milk warmed to about 110 degrees with 4 tablespoons of unsalted butter melted. All of the butter for this, I think I've mentioned before, is unsalted. Now, the last time I made this, I did use whole milk. This time I'm using 2% milk because that's the milk that I have. I'm hoping it doesn't make a big difference. I know that with whole milk with baking, it's a lot richer, but at the moment I just have the 2%, and I didn't want to waste getting whole milk when I'm not probably going to drink it. So right now, just so you know, the recipe does call for whole milk. I'm making it with 2%. Again, 1 cup whole milk, about 110 degrees, and then 4 tablespoons of unsalted butter melted. We're going to add that to this flour mixture, and that's going to become our dough. So I've warmed up my milk to about 110 degrees, and I've melted my butter, my 4 tablespoons of butter. Again, 1 cup of milk, 4 tablespoons of melted butter. I'm going to go ahead and add my milk. Okay. And also my butter. I'm going to use my spatula just to make sure I get all of the butter out of this. Now for the frosting, I'm going to be melting more butter, so I'm going to go ahead and save my butter bowl, because I will be using that again to melt the butter for the frosting. That'll go on at the very end after the rolls are out of the oven when they've cooled down. So I'm just going to go ahead and whisk this around. This is going to be the dough, this lovely dough. A little bit different. You know, we've used water, cold water, for other things, for the yeast, for that original no-knead bread that we made. This is 110 degree, or about that, for the milk, and that's what we're going to use to make the yeast rise as part of the activity. So we're just going to whisk this around a little bit. I want to be able to take this out, put on my surface, because we're going to roll it out. Okay, and that's nice and sticky. It does talk about the dough being sticky when it comes out. So we are, let's see, whisk together flour, granulated sugar, and all the business. Then we stirred in the melted butter and the milk, and it says dough will be sticky, and it is. So that is not a lie. It is promised sticky dough, and it has delivered on that. So we're going to go ahead and lightly flour our work surface here. You've seen this old deal where we put the lightly floured surface and roll out dough. So this is not new. I get a little flour on my hands to get it out because it is sticky. Okay. So I'm going to get this out and get a little flour on it so we can start rolling it and it doesn't stick to our table. So, and it talks about maybe doing this for about 2 to 3 minutes. And then we're going to roll it out. This is really simple. Roll it out into like a 9 by 12 rectangle. It's going to become sort of like a Yule log, or you know how, those pumpkin rolls. You know, sometimes the pumpkin rolls, that cheesecake pumpkin rolls that are rolled over, it's going to kind of resemble something like that. So that's basically what we're working toward. I just think of a Yule log for some reason. But we're just going to get this going. I think about this, you know, it is April. I guess it seems kind of odd maybe to make cinnamon rolls, although I think cinnamon rolls are great any day. A lot of times it's great to have them on a, Sunday morning. You can let these rise. I mean, I do them in one day. You can do it because the rise is only a 30-minute time span. So you could get up in the morning and legitimately have these as a Sunday morning. Sit and watch CBS Sunday Morning, read a good book, read the paper, read the New York Times, whatever your preference is, and just have a nice cinnamon roll with a nice cup of coffee or a glass of cold milk. So that's a really, these really are not long at all. This is something you can legitimately do on a Sunday morning or Saturday morning or any morning. But for our purposes, since I am still working, even though it's remotely, this is only a weekend exercise. So there we go. So I think we've got it we've done it for about 2 to 3 minutes. I don't know if it's 2 to 3 minutes, but it seems like it's 2 to 3 minutes. So we're going to go ahead and roll that out to get our square. I'm going to go ahead and use the very audible rolling pin. And I kind of start with it as a round, and now I'm going to get back to those darn rectangles that I kind of encountered for that whole croissant thing. People have asked me if I've uploaded those yet, but even though I've edited them, they're pretty big files, and that was not a quick. It's pretty kind of tricky to edit those. It's a 2-day baking marathon. So we may get episode 4 here with the cinnamon rolls before we get episodes 1 and 2 for the croissants. That is an entire legitimate possibility. Now, you notice I'm not being as oh my gosh, I am going to get my tape measure out here because now that we've goofed it up, gunked it up, we can definitely use it as our baking measuring tool. We've got about, actually 12 by 13, so I guess that's probably a little bit bigger than we need. But you know what? That's okay. At least it's not smaller than we need, okay? Basically, we want to get a rectangle because you kind of know where this is going. I'm going to go ahead and melt 1 tablespoon of butter, and then I'm going to brush that on my dough. That will receive that mixture we had, that filling, the half cup packed light brown sugar and the 1 tablespoon of cinnamon that we're going to go ahead and put on top of the butter once we use our pastry brush and put the butter on. And you want to put, basically hold your filling back about a ½ inch from around the sides. I'm gonna go ahead and melt, this is what I get for fussing around too much. I'm gonna go ahead and melt a tablespoon of butter and we're gonna brush it on. While we're waiting for the butter to melt, let me just tell you about a couple things I've been reading along with the musical journey I've been on over the past few years. And I don't necessarily read a lot of autobiographies for some reason. I don't know why, it's neither here nor there, but for some reason I got on a kick of reading autobiographies of musicians or artists from a certain time. Oh, that means my timer's off in the oven. It's 350 degrees. Preset your oven for 350 to bake the rolls. So I've been reading just on a sort of succession. I've been reading Me by Elton John, Wham by Andrew Ridgeley, which is fascinating. I threw in a little bit of Julie Andrews' Homework, so that's always a great mix to put in there. Debbie Harry's Face It was interesting. I didn't know as much about Debbie Harry as I would have liked, so I learned a lot about her, and she was the lead singer for Blondie. But also, one of my favorite autobiographies was Johnny Marr's Set the Boy Free. And Johnny Marr was half of the Smiths. And we saw Johnny Marr, I'm going to say this a couple years ago, because that's my kind of my spiel. But this autobiography was really was about Johnny Marr and his part of the inception of the Smiths, but also the whole scene at the time of the music scene, I would say, of the late 70s, 80s. It was just a really insightful look into that time. And since I sort of maturated on that music when I was in high school and college, for me, the reason I came to love new wave music was really my brother was the first to go to college, and he brought home, the first 2 albums he brought home were Devo and Yaz. And Yaz changed my life. I would say that Upstairs at Eric's and Alice and Moyet really shaped my musical interest from early 80s, 82, 83 to really today into 2020. So, you just never know who what's gonna influence you, and what key thing or what musical thing will come home to you, so to speak, and really set you up for the rest of your life. So my butter's melted, and we're gonna go ahead and brush it on generally our 9x12 dough, okay? And then we're gonna put our filling on top of that. So I'm gonna go ahead and just brush this on with my pastry brush. My pastry brush has been a lot of different things. You've seen that in the first episode where we used the pastry whisk for, a water sprayer. So that was kind of fun. So, and I put the egg wash on the croissants, which you have not seen yet, but it makes an appearance in episodes 2 and 3 if those ever get uploaded. All right, so we have our butter on our butter brush, so we will no longer need the pastry brush. And now we're going to go ahead and put that lovely, lovely brown sugar and cinnamon filling. Okay, and then I'm just going to put it on because I'm going to pat it into place. You want to indent it a little bit into the butter and the dough just so it adheres and it kind of stays in place. Like I said, I went ahead and did the syrup while we were waiting for the butter to melt for the last time for this particular episode. So it's a little bit closer to when we actually put these on top of it to go into the oven. So the syrup is now ready. It's sitting aside on top of the stove. All right, good to go. The oven has been preset, and you heard the timer go off at 350. And these will actually go in, these will go, once we cut them up and put them on top of the syrup in the skillet. These will go ahead and rise though for 30 minutes. So it's always this 30-minute timing we seem to have, but before it goes in the oven, it will have 30 minutes to also rest and rise on top of the stove before we put it in. So I'm gonna go ahead and start with the long way and just start rolling it up like you would, as I said, like a Yule log or some type of cheese roll or pumpkin roll. Okay, I had a little split there, but it'll be fine. All right, so we really want this nice sort of log that we have, because we're going to divide this into eighths, okay? So we're going to divide our log here into 8 rolls or cinnamon rolls, and that's what we're going to put on top of our syrupy mixture in our cast iron skillet. Okay, so I'm going to get my measuring tape out really quick just to see. It doesn't have to be, you know, these are cinnamon rolls, and I just want to kind of divide them up. We've got a little over 15 inches. So I want to do my cuts. I'm going to go ahead and use my sort of pastry cutter. I want 8. Maybe I'll use a sharp knife. This is always the part that sometimes I end up with like 6, 8. Sometimes I end up in the center and that doesn't give me my 8. So I'm just going to do a few light little cuts now just to see if I get my 8. What have I got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I actually end up with 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You know what? My log is a little bit longer than the 12 inches. It's actually at 15. So I'm going to go ahead and actually do the 9. It doesn't hurt anything. And as you can see how sharp my pastry cutter is. Makes just a nice clean cuts in my dough and my filling. It makes it a lot easier. There we go. All right. So now what we're going to do, I'm going to go ahead and bring over my cast iron skillet. Okay. So I've brought over my cast iron skillet and you can see the syrup is ready to go. So I just put, with the roll side up, I just place, and I'm going to start one in the middle of the cinnamon roll so it just looks nice. So we're going to go ahead and put the rest just around the outside. Roll up, if you will. Just make a little pinwheel around that center, the center roll. And actually the 9, interestingly enough, allows us to have our pinwheel center. So we're going to just sit them in like that. I'm going to kind of make it a little bit more like a pinwheel. And I'm actually going to cover this with saran wrap and let it sit for 30 minutes before it goes in the oven. While we're waiting for our rolls to rise before we put them in the oven, we might as well go ahead and make our frosting. So what we're going to do is we have a cup of confectioner's sugar. And since this is kind of an odd, it's hard, you know, confectioner's sugar is kind of tricky to get out of something. I'm going to go ahead and use my little scoop to make my full cup as opposed to trying to get my cup in the box bag, and or, you know, when you try to do this type of technique, you get confectioner's sugar everywhere. So we don't want that. So we're going to go ahead and use our scoop here and do it in smaller chunks. And we probably waste less of the confectioner's sugar than normal. I don't know, maybe you don't have this happen, but sometimes when I use confectioner's sugar, boy, if you're not careful, you can have it everywhere, and it's so fine that it can make quite a mess. So we're going to go ahead and put that cup into our mixing bowl. We're going to go ahead and add our 2 tablespoons of melted butter, or softened butter. It says softened butter. I seem to have lost any spatulas. I'm going to go ahead and put my softened butter in the bowl. Then I'm going to use a tablespoon of milk. And again, I told you about my milk situation. I actually only have 2%. But I think we'll be just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and put a tablespoon of the milk into my mixing bowl. And then I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to actually put the salt in first just because of wet ingredients, touching other wet ingredients. It's not the same measuring spoon, but I'm going to go ahead and add 1/8 teaspoon of salt. And then 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla extract. So I have my dry salt, and even though it's a different spoon size, I want to go ahead just because sometimes when I do it the opposite way around, I tend to fling vanilla everywhere. So again, it's 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla. So really we're ready to go. We will not put this on until at least 10 minutes after the rolls have cooled when they've been out of the oven, but at least we can get it ready and have it on deck. So while we've been waiting for the dough to rise, I went ahead and whisked all those ingredients, and we will use this as our frosting for the cinnamon rolls probably about 10 to 15 minutes after they come out of the oven. If you do it too much sooner than that, it doesn't set. It just sort of melts all over and becomes more gooey than you really want. You've got enough with the syrup, but I'd go 10 to 15 minutes. These have been rising and resting for the last 30 minutes, and now they're going to go into a 350-degree oven for 30 minutes. Oh man, I just got these out of the oven. I wish you could smell the smell that is emanating throughout the house. It's that wonderful smell of cinnamon and brown sugar. Well, mainly it's the cinnamon, but it's an incredible smell. And what a beautiful pinwheel we have of cinnamon rolls. And all of this in our cast iron skillet. So what we're gonna do is let this cool down for 10 to 15 minutes. The recipe says 10 minutes specifically, but I find that that still is a little warm. So we're gonna go ahead and let it cool down for 15 minutes, and then we're gonna go ahead and put on our frosting. We're going to go ahead and put our frosting in our 15-minute cooled cinnamon rolls. And you can see how lovely they look. So we're just gonna go ahead and use a spatula. Although this may be, we'll see how this goes. Maybe a spatula isn't the best idea. You don't need a lot of frosting on these. You know, really it's gonna be, the magic's gonna happen by what's underneath. We've got the syrupy sort of goodness underneath. And so when you take out the cinnamon rolls, you know, we'll have our syrup that we put down, we laid down as our base earlier. So the frosting will be on this side that we're looking at right now, but on the underside will be all of that syrupy goodness that we put on the bottom of the cast iron skillet. So we're just gonna go ahead and maybe the spatula isn't the best idea, but at least it's not completely melting over. I mean, it is melting a little bit, but not. Sometimes if the cinnamon rolls are too warm right in the beginning when you get them out of the oven, they're just melts completely all over the place. So put the last of the frosting on. It's actually probably, you know, you think when you make it up that it isn't a lot of frosting, but the cinnamon rolls at the end of the day don't really need that much frosting. There's so much of the syrup underneath that you don't really need a ton of frosting. So this is probably just enough. So we've got our cinnamon rolls frosted, ready to go, and they are going to be a great little snack, a great breakfast read. Whatever you want to do, these cinnamon rolls are sure to please.